So I'm going to make a video about Vegan Gains, also known as Brandon. I don't know his last name. But so Vegan Gains' reaction to Joe Rogan's reaction to the Game Changers. Basically, Vegan Gains tries to argue that adhering to a vegan or vegetarian diet is very easy and sustainable, and a lot of people do it, and he twists a lot of data to show that, and he also uses some other statistics, cherry picking it from other studies to show his point. The reason I'm making this video is he calls Joe dishonest, and he does it repeatedly, and actually it's Brandon who's being dishonest here, and that will become abundantly clear as we get through this reaction video.
Hi everyone. So the other day I saw the documentary The Game Changers on Netflix, and it's fantastic. I recommend you all go and watch. The documentary focuses on the health and athletic benefits of the vegan diet, and they featured a lot of vegan athletes in the documentary. And apparently Joe Rogan also saw this documentary, and he was pretty triggered by it, triggered enough to go on a long ramble on one of his recent podcast episodes about how a vegan diet is terrible for your health. Most people quit after a short period of time. The Game Changers documentary was terrible. So we're just going to rebut each of Joe Rogan's claims point by point.
They're just trying to be activists. You know, they're trying to get a message out. And most of them will quit. They're going to quit veganism and they're going to start eating meat again because of their health.
Yeah.
That's the truth. It's some ridiculous number. Google this. What number? I think they said the number of vegans and vegetarians that eat meat when they're drunk is something outrageous. It's like close to 90%.
Yeah. Well, no
But
kidding.
how many vegans wind up quitting and eating meat? I wonder if they've ever done a study on that.
So Joe is confusing two studies here. There was a recent study that found about a third of vegetarians.
So it's important to point out that he's accusing Joe of confusing two studies. Actually, what happened is Joe said, he mentioned this particular study from the Huffington Post, and he said, oh yeah, 90%. He get the number wrong. About a third actually eat meat when they've had too much to drink. But then he said, okay, are there any other studies that have shown the number of people who actually quit veganism or vegetarianism? And that's all I got from the video. So yeah, that's all I got from Joe's video. So he's actually not confusing anything. He just asked a question about whether there's another study.
Vegetarians end up eating meat when they're drunk, which is not too surprising to me. I don't particularly like most vegetarians. They tend to be hypocrites and very flaky people.
Yeah, so just eating meat whenever you get drunk makes you a hypocrite or a flaky person. It's not just like a weakness or anything like that. It just makes you sort of a bad person. That's really charitable of you, Brandon.
And there was a much earlier Funalytics study which found 84% of vegetarians and vegans end up quitting their diet and going back to eating animal products. Now, it seems that Joe...
Like, do you really want anybody to go vegan or vegetarian because of the Game Changers? Because a lot of the people those are going to be people you don't like, it sounds like. So what's the point here? It's kind of confusing what the point is. It's almost like he wants to use his dislike of those people to suggest that Joe's point is not important or not relevant, but that's not really relevant to Joe's point. Joe's point was that most people actually do, or many people actually do cheat and eat meat even when they're drunk and during other times, and that's actually the fact, whether or not Brandon likes those people or not.
Joe is trying to argue that the vast majority of people who are vegan right now will eventually quit their diet and go back to eating meat, and he's referring to the Funalytics study as...
He's not referring to the Funalytics study at all, unless there's another part of the clip we didn't actually see.
Evidence. Well, if you actually take a look at the Funalytics study, there was no vegan subgroup. They only combined vegans and vegetarians together to get their numbers. So claiming that the Funalytics study shows that the vast majority of vegans quit their diet is dishonest. There was no vegan subgroup. And on
He's not referring to the Funalytics study at all. He just asked a question whether a study exists in the video. So he can't possibly be dishonest about asking a question about a study he doesn't know about. So it's really dishonest to call him dishonest.
top of that, if you actually look at the data they collected, 58% of current vegans and vegetarians in their study had been vegan and vegetarian for more than 10 years. So obviously this diet is pretty sustainable for the majority of people.
Wow. So he says just because the vast or the majority of current vegetarians and vegans have been vegan or vegetarian for more than 10 years means that for the vast majority of people, veganism and vegetarianism is sustainable, that assumes that the current vegans or vegetarians vastly outnumber the number of former vegans or vegetarians, or at least outnumber it to a substantial degree, because in order for 58% to actually be the majority of people who have ever tried veganism or vegetarianism, the number of former vegans and vegetarians would have to be very small. Or otherwise, that 58% would turn into like 10% of total people who have ever tried veganism and vegetarianism. I hope you guys are following. If you're not, let's take a look at this particular study that he's actually talking about, the Funalytics study, and he should be aware of this because I scrolled down and saw this within about 5 seconds of looking up the Funalytics study. And this is the graph that I want to point out. Look, as you can see here, the percentage of former vegans or vegetarians is 10%, current is 2%. And more specifically, former is 10.2% and the current is 1.9%. What that means is if you add 10.2 to 1.9, you get 12.1. So the number of former vegetarians, the percentage of former vegetarians of the total number of people who are current or former vegetarians is 10.2 over 12.1, which is to say 84%. So 84% of people who are current or former vegetarians right now, vegetarians or vegans right now, 84% of them are actually former. That means that 84% of people who have tried vegetarianism or veganism right now in the United States, 84% of them have quit. So that's actually the better statistic to use. According to this particular study, the same Funalytics study that he's talking about, only about 16% of vegetarians today, former and current, only 16% have remained vegans or vegetarians, which shows that Joe's correct.
Also, 34% of former vegans and vegetarians quit before making it 3 months on the diet, with 53% of former vegetarians and vegans quitting before even making it a year on the diet, and 18% of former vegetarians and vegans quit between 1 and 2 years on the diet.
This is just him.
That means all these numbers totaled up.
Numbers.
Well, that's not true. If you actually take a look at the Funalytics research, these diets are quite sustainable, and as long as you make a commitment to them, you can follow them for a very long period of time.
Yeah, as long as you make a commitment to them, you can follow them forever. The question is how much is most people's commitment actually going to be? In general, on average, it's only about 16% of people who have been vegan or vegetarian, only about 16% are currently that. So whether or not you make a commitment, it's just sort of moving the goalpost. If you make a commitment to anything, you can do almost anything. The question is, what will people make a commitment to?
This is like a big thing because, there's been a movement, sort of a movement, and people have different success rates with being a vegan. But Cam Newton, who is a quarterback of the Carolina Panthers, big dude, 6'6", 250, 260.
All right, I'm going to skip ahead on this particular point because what Brandon says is, he says about this guy, Cameron Haynes, he says, he's cherry-picking athletes that have done poorly on veganism, and there's a lot of athletes who have done well on veganism. I actually agree with that, so I don't really need to take issue with Brandon's point here. And let's find where we end at this point. This is him being outraged. This is game changer stuff.
Issues to his vegan diet, but you're ignoring all of the other places. You can actually go to websites with a link. Just so typical of Joe Rogan when like dick.
Yeah. Let's get on to the next point.
Well, you know that guy, Dr. Sean Baker. He's the advocate of that carnivore diet. He marks all these people that were originally in that game.
I don't know why Joe would be citing Sean Baker so much. Sean Baker sucks, and he's probably one of the worst people in the nutrition and diet community around. He's about as bad as Brandon is being in this video. So it's really frustrating how much Joe actually talks about and thinks about Sean Baker, and I think it's to his discredit for sure. So let's not even, and so basically the point that he's making is a bunch of people dropped out of the documentary. They had to be excluded because they became non-vegan before it was over. Many of the athletes. I don't really know or care about this point. It sounds like Brandon is telling the truth here. If he's not, it's not really an interesting point to me. It's not really a scientific point. We've already established that only about 16% of vegans and vegetarians actually remain vegan and vegetarian. So we don't really even need to talk about this point.
We've had was because of piss drinking,
Yeah,
not because
okay.
of a vegan diet.
Right.
It's an indoctrination movie, and
Yeah.
it's also extremely biased, and it's not focusing on all of the various problems that people have. It's only focused on the positive aspects of it. And
That's true. There's a lot of negative aspects that people can experience from a vegan diet, often because they do it wrong. But the really important part to remember about that is that people will tend to do the vegan diet wrong because the average person has a low level of nutritional literacy. We're not really taught about nutrition that much. So a lot of people have problems on the vegan diet that they wouldn't necessarily need to have if they understood a little bit more. And that's an important point. But let's keep going.
distorting the reality of those positive
Right.
messages, particularly like the strong man who's on a load of steroids.
Okay, so he talks about. It's also important to point out that once again, that Joe is really biased as well, and he's always tries to trash on vegans. He actually cites Sean Baker, and he continues to cite Sean Baker in his podcast, and I think that's a mistake. So and then the next thing he talks about is this guy who is a strong man, but he takes a bunch of steroids. And then Brandon rightly responds that pretty much all like elite strongmans take a bunch of steroids. So why does he only focus on the vegan who takes a bunch of steroids whenever he could focus on the other people? The point of the Game Changers movie, I haven't actually watched it yet. I'm gonna watch it later. The point of the Game Changers movie, as I understand it, is to show that on a vegan diet you can be at an elite level as an athlete, and that's all that the point is. And I think that is true, and that's correct in Game Changers. At least on an anecdotal level, suggested that's true. I don't know what the percentage of people who actually do better or worse on a vegan diet as an elite athlete. I don't know what any of that is, but it's true that you can be at any elite level as a vegan athlete. And it's probably just related to protein intake, at least with respect to strength sports. And Lane Norton showed that with some really interesting studies about muscle protein synthesis and the leucine content of protein. And basically, you just need to equalize the leucine content of protein in order to make it as anabolic as animal protein. So I'm not surprised that a strong man can be at the highest level and be a vegan. It's not. It's just a matter of getting enough protein, and vegans can get enough protein. Let's keep going.
Joe himself takes steroids.
Yeah. That's
They're
fine.
competing against are doing it, despite being 12
Yeah.
years. So what's your excuse for that?
It's very controversial research that came out,
course.
but it's a very repeated number of 84% of vegans and vegetarians end up going back to eating meat at some level.
Yeah, right.
That's actually the number that I cited. So I think Brandon's going to try to save this here because he knows that he's wrong, but he wants to try to mislead his followers because the more rah-rah, I guess the more clicks. I'm not really sure. Maybe he believes his own nonsense, but it is nonsense. So let's just watch how
Right before they die.
Folks,
basically
we're
misleads people.
omnivores. We're
Yeah.
omnivores. We exist better. We are more healthy on an animal and vegetable diet.
Yeah.
So
I don't know if that's necessarily true, but let's just keep going.
again, Joe Rogan is misrepresenting the findings of that Faunalytic study to paint this narrative that most vegans are just going to end up quitting anyway because the diet is unsustainable. But no, if you actually take a look at the data from that research, most of the people who are ex-vegans or vegetarians, they quit within the first 2 years of following the diet. But if they followed
He uses inappropriate data to make his points. This is the real data that Brandon should be using. I don't know why he isn't using it. I mean, either he's not aware of it or he's intentionally misleading people, but he's wrong here.
the diet for more than 2 years, chances are they'd follow the diet for these diets for a very long. People just end up quitting.
So he's just basically rationalizing for like 2 minutes, like the sustainability issues with veganism. It's really transparent because he's wrong.
Are you going to claim that? Are you going to claim ridiculous for you to claim diabetes and certain forms of cancer? And according to the most recent cohort study out of the UK, only the vegan and vegetarian diet group had a statistically significant reduction in all-cause mortality risk.
So this is a cherry-picked this is a cherry-picked statistic. If you actually look at the EPIC Oxford study, the actual study that he's citing, and it's the same exact study, you can even compare it. We can go right here. Right here, look, you see mortality in vegetarians and comparable non-vegetarians in the United Kingdom, Paul Appleby and through Timothy K., right? Mortality in comparable mortality in vegetarians and comparable non-vegetarians in the United Kingdom, again, Appleby through K. And this is vegetarians and others. So it's the same paper. It's the same exact paper. And so he's going to say something.
Study out of the UK,
That's
only
wrong.
the vegan and vegetarian diet group had a statistically significant reduction in all-cause mortality risk. So these diets are sustainable, Joe.
So if you actually look at the abstract, this is like the first thing that they mention. United Kingdom-based vegetarians and comparable non-vegetarians have similar all-cause mortality. There was no difference, no significant difference in overall all-cause mortality between the diet groups. So how come he's finding that that there's a difference, whereas the study, if you look at the abstract, shows no difference? Before we actually dive into that, I want to point out one other thing. The low meat eaters had the lowest hazard ratio of all-cause mortality. It was not statistically significant. The fish eaters had a little bit higher, and the vegetarians had actually slightly higher, but totally not statistically significant. So that's an interesting thing. It just strongly suggests that vegetarianism is not associated with an all-cause mortality improvement. So why does Brandon think that it is? Well, if you look back at the text that he highlights, we can see he basically looked in the text for a part that would support his view, which is that when we excluded data for participants known to have changed diet group at least once during follow-up, there was no significant difference in risk between groups for all cause of death combined. There's no significant difference in risk between diet groups for all causes of death combined. So it's like they're even saying there's no significant difference, even when you exclude data. I didn't even notice this before I look back at this again. There's no significant difference, yet he's saying there's a significant difference. He actually highlighted the part that says there's no significant difference in risk, and then he like cherry picks the vegans and vegetarians, whereas the low meat eaters also showed a decrease, and actually the fish eaters also showed a decrease. The fish eaters great. The confidence interval is like slightly better for the vegans and vegetarians, and if he thinks that's what causes this to be statistically significant and more important than the other ones, that's a really shoddy argument, because that's like a really borderline difference in statistical significance, and he had to cherry pick that particular. He had to cherry pick that finding in order to make that claim. And as they say in the text, there's no statistical significant difference in risk. So it's sort of like I don't even understand what's going on in this paper exactly. I don't understand what's going on in the statistics here in this paper. They're saying one thing, he's actually saying something entirely different from the paper. And if his claim of difference is correct and the paper is itself wrong, which is not, but let's say it was, it would only be wrong by like a tiny, by barely anything. So he's basically making a mountain out of a molehill, and this is a really inappropriate use of scientific research. This is really misleading use of scientific research. He's either really ideologically biased or he's trying to mislead people.
Group had a statistically significant reduction in all-cause mortality risk. So these diets are sustainable, Joe. Most people who go vegan and vegetarian do actually stick to these diets long-term.
No, they don't. About 16% stick to it long-term. 84% don't. And Joe was actually right on this point.
And vegans and vegetarians tend to be healthier. So again, you're very quickly running out of excuses, Joe.
This idea that you're going to save the world, listen, large.
All right, so I agree with Brandon here about the environmental impact of veganism and vegetarianism to a degree. whenever he talks about greenhouse gases, I don't even know if I have time to talk about this. Basically, the EPA data talks about agriculture, and the FAO, the UN FAO data also talks about agriculture. They have discrepant findings for greenhouse emissions for agriculture and for animal agriculture as well. The reason that's the case is that the EPA data are applied to the United States, and the UN FAO data apply to the rest of the world. The problem is the United States actually on a per capita level, and even as a total amount of emissions, and as on a per capita basis as well, we actually produce relatively few emissions compared to some really bad emitters like China and several countries in South and Latin America. So they actually increase the total percentage of emissions coming from animal agriculture in the entire world, and the United States is actually a little bit better off here. That said, the other points that Brandon makes about land use, water use, all these other resource use issues is correct. And if we did have a more plant-based diet, the environment would be better off. But as far as greenhouse gases are concerned, I think he is pretty amateur in his use of statistics on this point. And I actually covered that in depth in 2 articles on greenhouse gases in beef. In Brazilian beef and in beef in general. Go vegan. I think my blog post is called "Go Vegan for the Environment" or something like that. You guys can check it out. It's on my website.
Rogan is just cherry picking his sources because the credible source and billions of people would.
So this is a really important point that Brandon makes, and let's just let him make it.
You have if you just eat elk, you have way less impact on the greenhouse gases than you do if you're a vegetarian. And that's a fact.
Well, Joe, I agree with you. If we were to only eat elk, that would massively reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because if elk were our only food source, we'd quickly eliminate that food source and billions of people would die because they don't have any food. So I don't think that's the best way to go about things. I don't think we should starve ourselves to death by killing off the only animal we allow ourselves to eat.
Right.
If you're
So he's right. And so basically, Joe is trying to suggest that if we just ate these wild animals, then we don't have to have these environmental problems to do with meat. The problem with that is there's not enough of these wild animals to eat. So if we wanted to eat these wild animals instead of eating cattle, we'd all have to dramatically reduce our meat intake. And I do think we should substantially reduce our intake, maybe even dramatically reduce our meat intake. I think it would be better for the environment. It would be better for health. In that respect, I'm totally in agreement with Brandon. I think it's a really impractical thing that Joe said.
You're eating grain. Not only that, you're eating grain, man. You're responsible for a load of death.
Yeah, I'm not really interested in this issue of farm animals and that kind of stuff dying. It's not really interesting to me. Let's see what else there might be interesting stuff. Yeah, okay, so that's basically it. That's basically Brandon's wrong. Vegans and vegetarians don't adhere. They don't sustain the diet. It is really unsustainable. Joe's wrong in his comments about the environment, and I don't think it's necessarily true that people have to be omnivores. I think a well-formulated vegan diet can be very healthy, but I think the vast majority of people who are going to try vegan diet are not going to be healthy on a vegan diet and will be deficient in vitamins and minerals because of the vegan diet. I think that's been conclusively shown, and that was actually shown through the EPIC Oxford study. That was shown that vegans and vegetarians have lower vitamin status than omnivores. So I think there's some truth on both sides here, some good points on both sides. I think that Brandon is not arguing in good faith. He's not particularly adept at a lot of the research in this area. And I think that's one of the big reasons why Joe doesn't want to have him on his podcast, and I wouldn't want him to have him on his podcast either. Thanks for watching.